The autumn wind howled across the Nevada desert as Marcus Chen gripped the steering wheel of his silver Honda Accord, eyes fixed on the empty stretch of Route 93 ahead. Beside him, his best friend since college, David Brennan, scrolled through his phone, squinting at the GPS screen that glowed in the darkness of the October evening. It was 1997, and they were heading from Las Vegas to Twin Falls, Idaho, for a friend's wedding, a drive they'd made twice before without incident. The desert landscape stretched endlessly on both sides of the highway, painted in deep purples and oranges as the sun disappeared behind distant mountain ranges. Marcus had left his San Francisco apartment 3 days earlier, driving down to Vegas to meet David, who'd flown in from an assignment in Arizona. They'd spent 2 nights at the Luxor, losing modest amounts at blackjack tables and catching a Cirque du Soleil show that left them both amazed and slightly confused. Now, with the wedding scheduled for Saturday afternoon, they had roughly 8 hours of driving ahead of them, most of it through the loneliest stretches of Nevada highway imaginable. "Says there's a shortcut coming up," David muttered, his voice barely audible over the rattling air conditioning. "Cuts 40 minutes off the trip." Marcus glanced at the device mounted on the dashboard, one of those new portable GPS units that cost him nearly $400 at Circuit City. Technology was supposed to make life easier, more efficient. His entire career in Silicon Valley had been built on that premise. "You sure? I don't remember any shortcuts through here." David zoomed in on the small screen, his photographer's eye studying the digital map with professional scrutiny. "Shows a road cutting northeast, reconnecting with 93 about 30 miles up. Could save us close to an hour if the road's decent." Before you continue with this story, I'd love to hear from you. Please subscribe to the channel and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. It helps us bring you more stories like this one. The GPS recalculated, its electronic voice chirping directions that seemed oddly insistent. "Turn right in 0.3 miles. Marcus had always trusted technology, had built his career in San Francisco's booming tech industry on that very principle. At 32, he was a senior developer at a startup that had just secured Series B funding, his stock options potentially worth millions if things went well. David, also 32, was a photographer for National Geographic, currently working on a long-term project documenting the changing American West. Both men were at the peak of their professional lives, confident in their abilities, comfortable with taking calculated risks. "That doesn't look like a road," David said, as they approached the turnoff, a narrow dirt path branching off into the darkness, barely visible against the sagebrush and scattered Joshua trees. "GPS says it connects to Highway 93 further north," Marcus replied, already slowing down. "Could save us an hour, maybe more, and honestly, I'm getting tired of this straight highway. A little variety might keep me awake." What neither of them knew was that the road had been closed since 1989, after a flash flood during an unusually violent monsoon season had washed out a bridge 3 miles in. The county had erected barriers and posted closure signs, but vandals had removed them within months. The GPS database was outdated, pulled from maps that predated the flood by nearly a decade. The manufacturer had issued an update, but Marcus hadn't connected his unit to his computer in months. By the time he turned onto the rutted path, following the electronic voice's confident instructions, they were already committed to a journey that would test everything they thought they knew about survival. The Honda bumped along the deteriorating road, headlights cutting through clouds of dust that rose like phantoms in the darkness. Desert stretched endlessly on both sides, punctuated by skeletal Joshua trees that seemed to watch their passage with ancient, indifferent eyes. David kept his camera ready, snapping shots of the otherworldly landscape, even as unease crept into his chest. He'd spent years photographing remote locations across the American Southwest. the slot canyons of Utah, the badlands of South Dakota, the ghost towns of Montana. But something about this particular stretch of desert felt wrong, felt abandoned in a way that went beyond simple isolation. The road surface deteriorated with each passing mile, transitioning from packed dirt to loose gravel to something that barely qualified as a path. Sagebrush scraped against the Honda's undercarriage, and twice Marcus had to navigate around boulders that had rolled onto the road from nearby outcroppings. The GPS continued its monotone instructions. Continue straight, continue straight. But the confidence in that electronic voice now seemed less reassuring and more ominous. How long has it been? Marcus asked after what felt like an eternity, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. David checked his watch, the luminous dial showing 9:47 p.m. 23 minutes. Should have hit the highway by now, according to this thing. He tapped the GPS screen, as if physical contact might somehow correct whatever error was leading them deeper into the Nevada backcountry. The road was narrowing now, becoming less defined with each passing minute. What had started as a clear two-track path was now barely distinguishable from the surrounding desert. Twice, Marcus had to stop and get out, using his flashlight to identify where the road continued. Each time, he returned to the car with more dust on his expensive loafers, more doubt in his mind. When Marcus finally stopped the car completely, they sat in silence for a long moment, the engine ticking as it cooled, the desert night pressing in around them. Through the windshield, the stars were brilliantly visible, the Milky Way a luminous river flowing across the black sky. In San Francisco, Marcus never saw stars like this. In most of the places David photographed, light pollution muted the night sky. But here, in this forgotten corner of Nevada, the universe revealed itself in all its terrible beauty. "We should turn back," David said quietly, breaking the silence. Marcus nodded, his jaw tight with frustration and growing concern. He shifted into reverse, carefully backing up a few feet before attempting a three-point turn on the narrow track. That's when the rear tire sank into soft sand, hidden beneath a thin crust of dried mud. The wheels spun uselessly, the engine revving, the car settling deeper with each attempt to extract it. "Shit," Marcus breathed, pressing the accelerator more gently, trying to rock the car back and forth. But the Honda only dug deeper, the rear axle now resting on solid ground, the tire buried to the rim in loose sand. They both got out, the desert cold biting through their jackets, a shock after the day's heat. The temperature had dropped 30 degrees since sunset, a characteristic of high desert that both men knew intellectually, but were now experiencing viscerally. Marcus pulled out his flashlight and examined the situation. The rear passenger tire was hopelessly stuck, the sand around it disturbed and loose, offering no traction whatsoever. For 2 hours, they tried everything they could think of. They pushed while one of them operated the accelerator, their shoes slipping on the sandy ground, their breath coming in gasps. They gathered sagebrush and dead wood, placing it under and in front of the tire, trying to create a surface with enough grip to pull the car free. David even suggested deflating the tire slightly, something he'd seen done in a documentary about Saharan travel, but the result was the same. The wheels spun, the engine roared, and the Honda remained stuck. Their cell phones showed no signal, not even a single bar. Marcus tried walking in different directions, holding his phone above his head like some kind of technological divining rod, but the result never changed. No service. The GPS, now mocking in its uselessness, simply displayed a blank screen where the road should have been, as if even it had given up trying to make sense of their location. "We walk back," Marcus decided, checking his watch. It was nearly midnight. "Can't be more than 10-15 miles to the highway. We can flag down help, get a tow truck out here." David nodded. though both men knew that a 15-mile walk in the desert night without proper preparation or equipment was risky at best. But staying with the car seemed equally dangerous. They had perhaps 2 bottles of water, some granola bars from a Vegas gas station, and no real shelter if the temperature continued to drop. They gathered what they could: water bottles, the flashlight, a few snacks, David's camera equipment despite its weight, Marcus's jacket and a blanket from the trunk. They locked the car, an absurdly civilized gesture given their circumstances, and began walking back the way they'd come, their footsteps crunching on gravel, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The walk began easily enough. The road was clearer in reverse, easier to follow. Marcus led the way, flashlight beams sweeping back and forth, while David followed, occasionally stopping to photograph the landscape despite their situation. Professional habit overriding common sense. The moon was a thin crescent, providing minimal light, but their eyes gradually adjusted to the darkness. The desert revealed itself in shades of grey and black, familiar shapes made alien by shadow. But as they rounded a bend, following what they thought was the main road, David stopped abruptly, his hand reaching out to grab Marcus's shoulder. "Marcus, stop!" Ahead, barely visible in the flashlight beam, was what remained of a bridge. Twisted metal and concrete, jutting from a deep ravine like broken bones, like the ribs of some massive beast that had died and been left to decay under the desert sun. The road they'd been following ended abruptly at its edge, a sheer drop into darkness beyond. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. They approached carefully, Marcus directing the flashlight beam down into the ravine. The flashlight revealed the truth of their situation. A gap at least 30 feet across, maybe more, the sides of the ravine nearly vertical, composed of crumbling stone and loose earth. Below, in the darkness perhaps 40 feet down, they could hear the faint trickle of water, the aftermath of whatever flash flood had destroyed the bridge nearly a decade earlier. "We can't cross this," David said, stating the obvious but needing to say it aloud to make it real. "We go around," Marcus replied, but his voice held no conviction. The ravine stretched in both directions, disappearing into the darkness, its extent impossible to determine. They could walk for miles, following its edge, and never find a safe crossing. They could walk in the wrong direction entirely, moving further from the highway rather than toward it. That's when they saw it, on the far side of the ravine, partially hidden by an outcropping of red rock, was a structure. Small, square, man-made, a cabin maybe, or a mining shack from Nevada's silver boom days of the late 19th century. And in one window, impossibly, a faint light flickered. "Someone's there," David said, excitement and relief flooding into his voice. "They might have a radio, a phone line, something, someone who can help us." They shouted, their voices strong at first but quickly swallowed by the vast emptiness surrounding them. "Hello? We need help. Our car is stuck." Marcus pulled out his flashlight and began signaling SOS in Morse code, something he'd learned in Boy Scouts decades ago and never thought he'd actually use. The light in the cabin's window flickered, seemed to respond, or perhaps just coincidentally moved, but no one emerged. No answering shout came back across the ravine. "There's got to be a way across," Marcus said, his engineer's mind already working through possibilities. "The ravine can't go on forever. And there's clearly someone over there, which means they got there somehow." David was already scanning the ravine's edge, his photographer's eye trained to notice details others might miss. That's when he found it. A narrow path, barely visible even in the flashlight beam, that zigzagged down the ravine's face into the darkness below. It looked treacherous, possibly deadly, carved by animals or water rather than human hands. But it was their only option, short of returning to the car and waiting for rescue that might never come. The descent took 45 minutes, each step calculated, each handhold tested before trusting it with full body weight. Marcus went first, testing each foothold, finding the most stable route, while David followed close behind, his camera forgotten in his backpack, his photographer's hands now needed for gripping rock and root. Loose rocks skittered down ahead of them, clattering into the unseen depths, the sound taking long seconds to fade. Once, Marcus's foot slipped, and for a terrifying moment he hung by his hands, scrabbling for purchase, before finding a ledge that held his weight. At the bottom, they found the remains of a creek bed, mostly dry except for small pools of stagnant water reflecting the moon like scattered mirrors. The air smelled different down here, damp, mineral-rich, ancient. The walls of the ravine rose on both sides, cutting off the horizon, creating a claustrophobic feeling despite the open sky above. The climb up the other side was even worse, steeper, with fewer handholds, the rock face crumbling under their fingers. Marcus's hands were bleeding by the time he pulled himself over the edge, reaching back to help David up. Their friendship manifested in that moment of trust and mutual dependence. The cabin was closer now, perhaps 100 yards away across relatively flat ground. As they approached, details emerged in the moonlight and flashlight beam, weathered wood silvered by decades of sun and wind, a collapsed porch with broken steps, windows dark with grime accumulated over years. The light they'd seen was gone now, the window dark, and Marcus felt the first real stirrings of doubt. Had it been real, or just a reflection of their flashlight bounced back across the ravine? Had they risked their lives descending into and climbing out of that ravine for nothing? "Hello?" David called out, his voice cracking with exhaustion and stress. "We need help. Our car's stuck. We're not looking for trouble." The cabin door hung open, swinging slightly in the wind with a creaking sound that seemed too perfect, too much like a horror movie to be real. Inside, their flashlight beam revealed a single room, perhaps 15 feet square, empty except for debris. Broken furniture, a table with 2 legs missing, chairs reduced to kindling, a metal bed frame rusted and collapsed. Old newspapers, yellowed and brittle, scattered across the floor. A rusted kerosene lamp lying on its side, empty. The place had been abandoned for years, maybe decades. There was no light source, no generator, no kerosene for the lamp, no explanation for what they'd seen from across the ravine. "We imagined it," Marcus said, but he didn't believe it. Neither did David. They'd both seen that light, had both oriented themselves by it, but there was no rational explanation for it, and both men were too tired, too frightened, too deep in survival mode to pursue the question. They searched the cabin thoroughly, hoping to find anything useful, a radio, supplies, tools, anything that might help them signal for rescue or survive another night in the desert. They found nothing of value initially, just debris, decay, evidence of time's passage. But in the corner, partially hidden beneath a collapsed shelf, David found something that made his blood run cold, made his hands shake as he pulled it free from the debris. It was a GPS unit, older than theirs but similar, same brand, slightly earlier model. The screen was cracked, spiderweb fractures spreading across its surface, but when David pressed the power button, it flickered to life, the battery somehow still holding a charge after years of abandonment. The screen displayed a map, crude and pixelated, showing their location marked with a blinking dot. But there was something else, a route traced in red, leading from Route 93 down the same dirt road they'd followed, ending at this exact spot. And beneath the map, a timestamp displayed in small digital numbers, October 15th, 1995, 2 years earlier, almost to the day. "Someone else followed the same route," David whispered, his voice hollow. "Someone else got led here by their GPS. Someone else got lost." They searched more frantically now, adrenaline overriding exhaustion, pulling away debris, checking every corner of the cabin, looking for more evidence of who had been here before them. Behind the door, scratched into the wood with something sharp, a knife or perhaps a nail, they found names carved with desperate care. Robert Sullivan, age 34, Jennifer Sullivan, age 31, October 16th, 1995. Below that, in fresher scratches that looked like they'd been made with shaking hands, if you're reading this, we went south following the ravine, looking for help, running out of water. Please tell our families we love them. J.S. Marcus and David stood in silence, the implications settling over them like a burial shroud, heavy and suffocating. Two people, a couple probably married given the shared surname, had followed the same GPS error, had ended up at this same cabin, had carved their names, left a message, and then departed to seek help, had never been found, or at least had never returned to update the message. "We're getting out of here," Marcus said firmly, his voice carrying more confidence than he felt. "Now. We're not ending up like them." But which direction? The GPS had led them astray once. Trusting it again seemed not just foolish, but potentially suicidal. The ravine stretched east and west. The desert sprawled north and south. They had water for maybe 2 more days if they rationed carefully, perhaps 3 if they didn't exert themselves too much. No food beyond a few granola bars. No shelter beyond this decrepit cabin with its ominous messages scratched into wood. David pulled out a compass from his camera bag, old school technology, reliable, requiring no batteries or satellites. Route 93 should be east of here, maybe 10 miles as the crow flies. If we follow the ravine north, it should eventually lead us back toward the highway. Water runs downhill, and roads follow water sources. It was sound logic, the kind of practical reasoning that had kept humans alive for millennia before GPS and cell phones and modern technology. They gathered what little they could from the cabin, some old but dry wood that could be used for fire starting, a metal cup that could hold water, a tarp that was still mostly intact despite years of weathering. As dawn broke over the desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold, they began walking north, following the ravine's edge, moving away from the cabin and its dark history. The terrain was brutal, rocky, uneven, dotted with cacti that seemed to reach out with thorny arms, designed to snag clothing and pierce skin. Marcus's expensive loafers, perfect for San Francisco streets and startup offices, were disintegrating, the leather cracking, the soles separating from the uppers. David's hiking boots fared better, military-grade and broken in, over years of field work, but his feet were already blistering, hot spots developing on his heels and toes that would become open wounds by day's end. They walked in silence mostly, conserving energy, conserving breath, each man alone with his thoughts, even as they stayed within arm's reach of each other. The sun climbed higher, the temperature rising with it, the desert heat building like a living thing. They stopped hourly to sip water, just enough to wet their mouths, to keep their bodies functioning. By noon, they'd finished their first water bottle. By 3 p.m., they were halfway through the second. The ravine seemed endless, snaking through the landscape without purpose or destination, cutting through ancient stone laid down millions of years ago when this desert had been an ocean floor. They saw evidence of life, lizard tracks in the sand, the distinctive S-pattern of a sidewinder's passage, vultures circling high above on thermals. David photographed it all compulsively, his professional instincts operating on autopilot even as his conscious mind focused solely on survival. And then David stopped abruptly, his face pale beneath the sunburn that was already developing despite the late afternoon hour. His hand reached out, gripping Marcus's arm, pointing ahead with a shaking finger. "Marcus, look." Ahead, nestled in a depression beside the ravine, partially hidden by an outcropping of rock, was a vehicle. A blue Toyota pickup truck, mid-90s model, sun-faded and dust-covered, its paint oxidized to a chalky finish. The tires were flat, rotted rubber hanging in strips from the rims. The windows were intact, surprisingly unbroken, covered with a layer of dust so thick it was impossible to see inside. As they approached, slowly, reluctantly, Marcus felt his stomach tighten, felt dread rising like bile in his throat. The Nevada license plate was still legible, despite years of sun exposure, 2HGY847. The registration sticker showed an expiration date of September 1995. The doors were unlocked, opening with a creak of rusty hinges that seemed obscenely loud in the desert silence. Inside, they found two decomposed bodies, a man and a woman slumped together in the front seat, their skeletal hands still intertwined in a final gesture of love and companionship. The heat and dry air had mummified them partially, preserving their final moment in grotesque detail. They were dressed in hiking clothes, practical and weather-appropriate. The man wore a wedding ring that glinted gold in the afternoon sun. The woman's skull still bore traces of brown hair, brittle and sun-bleached. David turned away, stumbling to the side of the truck, retching into the sand, his body rejecting the horror of what they'd found. Marcus forced himself to remain calm, forced himself to search the truck, checking for anything that could help them survive. In the glove compartment, buried under maps and insurance papers, he found registration documents. Robert Sullivan, Jennifer Sullivan, 2847 Maple Drive, Reno, Nevada, the couple from the cabin. They'd made it this far, had tried to drive out following the ravine's edge, and had died here, maybe from dehydration, maybe from heat stroke, maybe from giving up hope, and simply waiting for an end that came slowly, painfully. "We can't end up like them," Marcus said, his voice steadier than he felt, his hands shaking as he closed the glove compartment. "We won't. We know what happened to them. We can learn from their mistakes." They took what they could from the truck, a half-empty water jug that had been sealed, the water inside stale and warm, but still drinkable, still life-sustaining. A first aid kit, mostly useless after years in the heat, but containing some items still viable. A wool blanket, moth-eaten but functional, and Marcus also found a journal, spiral-bound, tucked into the driver's side door pocket. Jennifer's journal, by the handwriting, documenting their ordeal in detail. Marcus read it aloud as they sat in the shade of the truck, needing to understand, needing to know what had happened. The entries started normally: excitement about a Vegas vacation, plans for the drive home to Reno, the decision to take a shortcut suggested by their new GPS, then confusion when the road didn't match expectations, then concern when the car got stuck, then fear as they realized they were lost. The final entry was dated October 19th, 1995, written in handwriting that had deteriorated from neat cursive to barely legible scrawl. Day 4. "We've been walking for 4 days now. No sign of the highway, no sign of anyone. Rob is getting weaker. He gave me most of his water yesterday and now he can barely stand. The GPS led us here, promised us a shortcut, and now we're trapped in this endless desert. We found a cabin, left a message, hoped someone would find it, but no one came. No one will come. If someone finds this, please tell our families we love them. Tell them we tried so hard to get home. Tell them we never stopped trying. I can see Rob in the truck waiting for me. I'm going to join him now. Better to be together at the end than apart." Marcus closed the journal, his hands shaking, his eyes burning with tears. He didn't have enough water to spare. 4 days. The Sullivans had survived 4 days before they'd given up, returned to their truck and died together rather than apart. He and David had been lost for barely more than 1 day. As the sun set on their second day in the desert, painting the sky in shades of purple and red that would have been beautiful under different circumstances, they found a small cave formation in the ravine wall. Not deep, just a shallow overhang, but enough to provide shelter from the night's cold and any predators that might roam the desert darkness. David built a fire using the wood they'd taken from the cabin and some dried brush, using his lighter, thank God he'd kept his lighter, to coax flames from tinder. The fire cast dancing shadows on the rock walls, creating an illusion of warmth and safety that both men desperately needed. They sat close to the flames, sharing the water they'd found in the Sullivan's truck, each sip measured and precious, each swallow a conscious decision to continue surviving. The night grew cold quickly, the temperature dropping toward freezing, and they huddled together under the moth-eaten blanket, sharing body heat, their friendship manifesting in practical necessity. "My wife is 8 months pregnant," David said suddenly, staring into the flames, his voice barely above a whisper. "Our first kid, a girl. We're naming her Emma." Marcus looked at his friend, really seeing him for perhaps the first time in years. They'd grown up together in Sacramento, attended the same high school, navigated college and career, and all of life's complexities side by side. But somewhere along the way, caught up in their own lives and successes, they'd stopped really talking, stopped sharing the important things. Marcus had known David was married, had attended the wedding 3 years ago. But he hadn't known about the pregnancy. "You never told me," Marcus said, his voice carrying no accusation, just surprise. "I was going to surprise you at the wedding tomorrow, announce it there, toast to new beginnings." David's voice cracked, emotion breaking through the facade of calm he'd been maintaining. "Sarah doesn't even know I'm missing yet. She thinks I'm just on the road, out of cell range. She won't start worrying until tomorrow when I don't show up at the wedding, and by then—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "We're going to make it," Marcus said firmly, gripping David's shoulder. "Your daughter is going to know her father. You're going to teach her how to use a camera, how to see the world the way you see it. This isn't how our story ends." They took turns keeping watch that night, feeding the fire, scanning the darkness for any sign of help, a distant light, a sound of engines, helicopters, anything. But the desert remained silent, vast, indifferent to their struggle. Marcus thought about his girlfriend back in San Francisco, about the startup that might or might not make him rich, about all the things he'd thought were important that suddenly seemed trivial compared to simple survival. David thought about Sarah, about their apartment in Sacramento, about the nursery they'd painted yellow because they wanted to wait to learn the gender, even though they'd found out anyway at the last ultrasound. Dawn brought clarity and a decision. They could continue following the ravine north, hoping it would eventually lead them to civilization, or they could strike out east toward where they believed Route 93 should be. The compass pointed the way unerringly, magnetic north, never changing, never lying. The terrain looked even more forbidding in that direction. No landmarks, no shelter, no water, just endless desert stretching to the horizon. But it was direct, it was decisive, and it might be their only real chance. East, Marcus decided, after they'd discussed it for nearly an hour, weighing options, considering risks. Straight toward the highway, no more following this damn ravine. We estimate 10 miles. We can cover that in a day if we pace ourselves right. They walked through the morning, the sun climbing higher with each hour, the heat building like a physical weight pressing down on them. The desert landscape was otherworldly in its beauty and brutality, vast expanses of sand, punctuated by rock formations that seemed sculpted by an artist's hand, colors ranging from deep red to pale yellow to almost white. Marcus's throat felt like sandpaper, his lips cracked and bleeding despite his attempts to keep them moistened. David stumbled frequently, his camera equipment long abandoned at their overnight camp. His focus narrowed to just placing one foot in front of the other, maintaining a rhythm, continuing forward. By mid-afternoon, They'd finished the last of their water, draining the jug from the Sullivan's truck with hands that shook from exhaustion and fear. The desert shimmered with heat mirages, making it impossible to distinguish reality from illusion. Marcus saw highways that weren't there, buildings that dissolved into sagebrush as they approached, pools of water that evaporated before they could reach them. His mind began to play tricks on him, showing him his apartment in San Francisco, his girlfriend waiting at the door with a cold beer, the office with its air conditioning and comfortable chairs. "Marcus!" David's voice cut through the hallucination, grounding him in reality. He was pointing ahead with a hand that shook, his arm barely able to lift. At first, Marcus saw nothing but more desert, more rocks, more endless, heat-shimmered space. Then he focused, concentrated, forced his sun-damaged eyes to see what was actually there, rather than what his mind wanted to create. A thin line cut through the landscape, darker than the surrounding terrain, geometrically straight in a way that nature never creates. A road. Not dirt, not gravel, but paved, maintained, real. Route 93. They ran, or tried to, their legs barely responding, their breath coming in ragged gasps that hurt their dried throats and sun-scorched lungs. The road materialized before them more fully with each stumbling step. Actual asphalt, with painted lines, with reflective markers along the shoulder, with all the infrastructure of civilization that they'd taken for granted every day of their lives until now. Marcus collapsed onto the asphalt, feeling its heat against his cheek, feeling solid certainty beneath him after 2 days of uncertain terrain. David sat beside him, laughing and crying simultaneously, his relief so overwhelming it manifested physically. They'd made it. Against odds, against dehydration, against the desert itself, they'd survived. They waited for 23 minutes. Marcus timed it by his watch, needing the precision, needing the concrete measurement. Then a truck appeared, a commercial semi-hauling freight from Vegas to Idaho, its chrome gleaming in the afternoon sun. The driver, a weathered man in his 60s named Earl Patterson, pulled over immediately when he saw them, his face registering shock at their condition. Sunburned, dehydrated, barely conscious, covered in dirt and dried blood. "Jesus Christ, where did you boys come from?" Earl's voice carried genuine concern, his hands already reaching for his CB radio. "Our car," Marcus managed to say, his voice a croak, "stuck off a dirt road, need water and police. We found bodies." Earl gave them water from his cooler, making them drink slowly despite their desperation, knowing that drinking too fast could make them sick. He called for help on his CB radio, and within 45 minutes, Nevada Highway Patrol arrived in 2 vehicles, along with an ambulance from the nearest town. The officers, one senior woman named Lieutenant Sarah Mercer and a younger male officer named Tom Rodriguez, listened to their story with growing concern, their expressions shifting from skepticism to alarm as Marcus described the abandoned bridge, the cabin with its carved messages, the Sullivan's truck with its tragic occupants. "We'll need to organize a search and recovery operation," Lieutenant Mercer said, her jaw tightening. "You're lucky to be alive." "That area has been officially closed since '89, after the bridge collapse. How the hell did you end up there?" Marcus showed her the GPS unit, still in his jacket pocket, still showing the fatal route on its small screen. She examined it, her expression hardening. "These things," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of knowledge, "have been leading people astray for 2 years now. Outdated maps, bad databases, no quality control. You're the first ones to make it out alive. 3 other vehicles have been found in that area over the past 18 months. All of them had GPS units with the same outdated software. All of them followed the same route. None of the occupants survived. The paramedics treated them for severe dehydration, sunburn and exposure, starting IV fluids immediately, monitoring their vital signs, discussing whether they needed hospitalization. But both Marcus and David refused to be taken to a hospital until after they'd given complete statements, until after they'd helped organize the recovery operation. They wanted to see their car recovered, wanted to help find the Sullivans and bring them home to their families, wanted to ensure no one else would follow that fatal route. The search and recovery operation took 3 days and involved multiple agencies: Highway Patrol, County Sheriff, Search and Rescue, even the National Park Service, since part of the affected area fell within federal land boundaries. A helicopter finally located Marcus's Honda on the 2nd day, still stuck in the sand where they'd left it, undamaged but inaccessible by ground vehicles. The Sullivans' truck was found next, and a team of investigators documented the scene, photographed everything, treated it with the respect owed to a tomb. The couple's remains were carefully recovered and transported to Reno, where they were finally buried after 2 years of their families living in agonizing uncertainty. The cabin proved harder to locate despite Marcus and David's detailed descriptions. The ravine system was extensive, branching in multiple directions, with dozens of similar geological features. When the search team finally found it on the 3rd day, using the helicopter for aerial reconnaissance, they discovered more than just scratched names on the door. In a makeshift grave behind the structure, marked with a cairn of stacked stones, they found the remains of 3 more people, hikers who disappeared in 1991, their fate unknown until now. The GPS era had been claiming victims for years, a digital siren song leading travelers into the desert to die alone and forgotten. Marcus and David spent a week in Reno, recovering physically and giving depositions, helping investigators understand exactly what had happened. They testified at a federal hearing about GPS accuracy and safety standards, their story making national news, sparking debates about technology dependence and the need for better quality control in navigation systems. Their testimony, combined with the physical evidence and the recovered remains, forced manufacturers to implement better map verification systems and created new protocols for reporting and correcting dangerous navigation errors. The stretch of Route 93 where the fatal turnoff existed was modified with permanent concrete barriers and multiple large warning signs. The dirt road was officially decommissioned and blocked at multiple points. The cabin was documented, photographed, and then deliberately collapsed to prevent it from becoming a macabre tourist destination. The ravine area was designated a memorial site, with a plaque erected near the highway listing the names of those who died there. David made it home to Sacramento 4 days before his daughter was born. He held Sarah close that first night, told her everything in detail, cried in her arms as the full emotional weight of the experience finally caught up with him. Emma Sullivan Brennan came into the world at 3:47 a.m. on October 26, 1997, healthy and screaming, her father present as he'd promised to be. Her middle name honored the couple whose deaths had likely saved other lives by finally forcing attention onto a problem that had been killing people for years. Marcus returned to San Francisco, but found he couldn't focus on work, couldn't care about stock options and funding rounds and all the things that had seemed so important before. He quit his job after 3 months, despite his colleagues thinking he was insane to walk away from potential wealth. He started working with search and rescue organizations, using his technical skills to improve GPS accuracy and develop better emergency communication systems for remote areas. He kept the GPS unit that had nearly killed them mounted on his office wall, a reminder that technology, for all its promise, is only as reliable as the humans who create it and the data they feed it. The road where they'd turned off Route 93 was officially closed, the entrance blocked with massive concrete barriers and warning signs visible from a quarter-mile away. But sometimes late at night, drivers reported seeing strange things in that stretch of desert, a faint light in the distance where the cabin had stood, figures moving along the ravine's edge. Park rangers investigated these reports several times, but found nothing conclusive. Just darkness, silence, and the endless Nevada desert stretching toward the horizon. Years later, Marcus and David still made the drive from Vegas to Twin Falls for their friend's anniversary party, an annual tradition that had survived despite the trauma of that October in 1997. But they never used GPS, never trusted the electronic voice that promised faster routes and efficient travel. They kept to the highway, windows down, radio playing classic rock, talking about their lives, their families, their survival. They drove during daylight hours only, and they always carried extra water, emergency supplies, and multiple communication devices. And every October, on the anniversary of their disappearance and rescue, they pulled over at that stretch of Route 93, where they'd turned off so fatefully. They stood at the barriers, looking out at the desert that had nearly claimed them, and remembered Robert and Jennifer Sullivan, two people who weren't as lucky, whose trust in technology had cost them everything, but whose deaths had finally brought attention to a problem that would save countless others. They remembered the three hikers whose names they'd never learned in life, but whose memorial plaque they'd helped dedicate. They remembered how close they'd come to joining those statistics, how thin the line between survival and death had been. The desert remained beautiful in its brutality, vast in its indifference, and unforgiving to those who entered it unprepared. But the road stayed clear, marked and maintained. The barriers held firm against curious travelers tempted by shortcut promises. And the GPS units were updated with accurate maps, with verification systems, with safety protocols born from tragedy. Sometimes, Marcus thought as he stood at those barriers each October, survival requires us to learn from those who didn't make it back, to honor their memory by ensuring their mistakes aren't repeated. Their suffering isn't meaningless. Their deaths serve some greater purpose. Technology would continue advancing, promising ever greater convenience and efficiency. But it would always be imperfect, always be dependent on human input and oversight, always be capable of leading people astray if not properly maintained and verified. The sun set over Nevada on that anniversary day each year, painting the desert in shades of amber and gold and deep purple, and Marcus Chen and David Brennan drove north on Route 93, grateful for every mile, every moment, every second chance they'd been given. Behind them, the desert stretched endlessly, keeping its secrets, holding its dead, waiting with infinite patience for the next person who would trust technology over instinct, convenience over caution, the promise of a shortcut over the certainty of the known path.